thanks so much for the invitation to come this evening, and I'm hugely impressed. Within 10 days, so many of you have been able to make it this evening, so thank you so much for coming. I said in Willinga Park this morning that this is my second visit to Australia. My first visit was nearly 35 years ago in my year off. I got to Australia, I'd been travelling for 3 months and I'd run out of money. So I then went to ride out for Bart Cummins for four weeks to earn some money. So my understanding of equestrianism in Australia is not zero, you'll be glad to know. I arrived on Anzac Day in 1986, and a friend of the family arrived in a pickup, and we went to the Sydney Harbour Bridge. He got out tables and chairs, a lot of friends came round, and we had dinner right next to the Sydney Harbour Bridge. It was quite something, so very fond memories. I said this morning that a friend of mine who's in the racing world came down to Australia a couple of years ago, and he said, so often you do at the beginning of a presentation, he said, "Can everyone hear me?" He forgot to say that at the beginning, and he was talking on quite a dry subject around rules, and about halfway through his presentation he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, can everyone hear me?" And someone at the front put his hand up and said, "Yes, I can hear you, but I'm very happy to swap with someone who can't." So I'm not going to ask you whether you can hear me or not. I've been asked initially to Willinga Park, and I'm delighted to be able to come and speak to you in Queensland this evening about a social licence for equestrian sport. What does that mean? So over the next, unless you will walk out, I'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we can have some question time afterwards, if that would be of interest. But in terms of our outline, I just want to introduce the organisation that I work for and our association with horse sport, just to talk about the changing society we live in. And it sounds somewhat trite to say that, but we certainly do live in a very interesting and changing world. To reflect on what we mean by, we often talk about equine welfare, but what constitutes good equine welfare, and is that changing? Then to introduce this idea of social licence, which might be familiar to some of you, but not to others. To reflect on how we can put all of that into practice, in terms of how we look after our horses on a day-to-day basis. And then just to reflect briefly towards the end about communicating about equine welfare, because I think that is one of the biggest challenges we face, and being able to do it better than we're doing now is really important for the future of the sport. And then to try and bring that all together at the end and say, so what? So World Horse Welfare is a charity that was founded in 1927. And at the heart of what we do is to be a practical but caring voice around equine welfare. Our founders witnessed British workhorses being exported for slaughter, having worked their whole lives on the farmland of Britain, and they were exported to France and Belgium in horrific conditions. Our founders' issue wasn't people eating horse meat, it was the conditions in which they were travelled, and it was the care that they were given at the end of their life, having served humankind all their lives. And I think that practical basis is very much at the heart of what we do. We've grown now to work internationally, as our name indicates, working across 4 continents, and we have a very big focus in Central America and increasingly across Asia. And in fact, we have a project which is currently clearly on hold in China around supporting equine veterinary education in that country. In terms of what does it mean in practice, there are 4 sort of key pillars of what we're involved in. I mentioned transport and slaughter, but also responsible ownership, especially within the leisure and recreational environment. Working equids, you'll see along the bottom, if you exclude the foal, there are 6 equines, 2 donkeys and 4 horses. That's scientifically done because in the world today there are 150 million equines. What you might not know is 112 million of those equines are working in low and middle income countries across the world, supporting the livelihoods of 750 million people. So I think one of the great challenges we face in today's society is people become more and more remote to horses, and yet equines still very much are the life and soul of the family livelihoods of so many people around the world, and it's very easy to forget that. So in terms of our activities, we don't do everything in every area, because in horse sport we're not around caring. We very much focus around research, education, and above all, influence. And the reason that we have that scale is that in the UK, for example, on our intervention work, we run the largest rescue and rehoming scheme in the country. We take in about 400 animals a year that have suffered abuse and neglect, and we'll rehome around 300 of those every year. And so we've got about 2,000 in homes across the country. But however hard we work in community engagement projects across the developing world, or through our interventions through our farms in the UK, we're only going to get to tens or hundreds of animals. When we've got 150 million animals in the world, the way you can make real change is by changing policy and changing legislation and an enforcement of that legislation. So that influencing work is where we're going to get to the big numbers, and therefore it's a matter of combination of combining that frontline work that we do in the UK and across the world with that influencing work. But of course, today is very much talking around our association with horse sport, and that goes back quite a considerable time. We've been welfare advisors to the International Equestrian Federation for the last 30 years. We've been carried out a similar role for British racing over the last 10 to 15 years. We're members of the British Equestrian Federation, and at the heart we support the responsible use of horses in sport. And what we want to talk about tonight is, what does that really mean? What does responsible use of horses in sport really mean? So if we think about the world we live in, I think it sounds, as I say, a bit trite to say it, a bit corny, but we do live in a very changing world. We live in a very changing world, we've already heard, partly because of social media. It's a great force for good, and it's also a great force for more challenging times as well. We live in a society where it becomes increasingly urbanised, and therefore people's association with farm animals, with equines, is becoming less and less. And especially in this part of the world, but across the world, we live in a world where animal activism is becoming more and more organised and more well funded. And that creates real challenges for horse sport across the piece, including horse racing. And in the main, when I'm talking about horse sport, I'm very much including racing in that. Because there's many of us who fundamentally and profoundly and passionately believe that our work with horses, our association with horses, is partnership. But there are many, many people now who believe that's exploitation. And taking that one stage further, we used to have a saying within the charity, it's about the use of the horse, not the abuse. But there's increasingly people who believe that any use is abuse, and that is something we simply cannot ignore. And one of the key messages tonight is that I think as a sector, as a sport, for too long now, we believe that we know what we're doing and the general public don't know what we're doing, but because we know what we're doing, we can just get on with what we do on a day-to-day basis. I'm afraid to say, if those days were not over previously, they certainly are now. And of course, because of social media, in part, we do live in a global world. And so what happens in one sport, racing, endurance, jumping, dressage, impacts all sports. Because whilst we might be very passionate dressage or endurance or racing, as far as the general public is concerned, that is people using horses for sport and entertainment. They don't differentiate between the different types of uses of horses. For them, it's horses being used in sport. And I think we are on this great ethical tightrope. I have to say, including this quote from the report that came out of the ABC programme last year when I was sitting in the UK, I thought it was a great idea. Sitting in Queensland, I'm thinking maybe I'm feeling a little less sure of myself, but I think it is really important just to take that. The racing industry in Australia has fundamentally failed to intervene at industry level to effectively care for and protect retired racehorses. Those are damning words indeed, and it's something that we really need to take to heart and very much reflect on. And I would say it's not just Australia at all. It is across the world, because it doesn't matter whether you're in the UK, the US, in Korea, in Ireland. There are bad news stories appearing almost weekly, and if they haven't happened this week, then they probably will next week. And this is the world we live in. The media does seem to focus in very much on those bad news stories, and we get buffeted from one incident to the next. And of course, it's most certainly not just racing either, because it is all horse sport that comes under the spotlight. Certainly in the world of dressage, certainly in the world of endurance, but indeed in all disciplines, the spotlight of scrutiny is growing. And certainly training methods in dressage have been something that have been well talked about, and hyperflexion for many, many years. But if we if you look at this on the right here, Hector Carmona is a Chilean who I think lives in Sweden, but he is a hugely active social media activist. And if you can read this, the FEI and SRS is the Spanish riding school, blatant horse abuse. That kind of coverage is being putting out on a daily basis. And I know with that regard, the FEI, the International Equestrian Federation, are spending a huge amount of time dealing with communications that come out of Facebook posts from Hector and a number of other individuals who are seeking, and we can call them keyboard warriors, you can call them what you like, but in many ways their heart is driven in the right way. You might just question the way that they're doing it, but whether you like it or not, they are here to stay, and we need to manage that whole process a lot better than we are doing now. And of course, you think back to last year, European Jumping Championships in Rotterdam. This is a Dutch rider, and during his round, two activists, vegan activists, managed to get into the arena to campaign or have a thing against horse abuse in horse sport. So this is very much the world that we're living in, and I don't think that would have happened at the European Championships even 4 years ago. And of course, because of social media, bad news does travel fast. And I know there's a lot of people who have a great frustration within the sport, because what the public perception is of the sport and what the reality is very, very different. But the problem is that the publics have that perception in part because of the negative media stories that come out almost on a daily basis. And I think we need to make sure, and I'll talk about this at the end around the communication, is that we need to be very careful around congratulating ourselves for looking after our horses when we use them in horse sport, because that's what the general public will expect as a minimum. And I think if we're going to change the way we support and defend our sport in some cases, then that's something we really do need to take to heart. So how is the sport world reacting? Well, of course, within outside racing, which has obviously a lot of frameworks around equine welfare, within the FEI, we have the FEI Code of Conduct, which was actually co-written, co-drafted with World Horse Welfare back in the 1990s. But what's lacking, whilst that is a very good set of principles around equine welfare, what I believe is lacking in many federations is actually incorporating the Code of Conduct within the strategies of individual federations. And I can certainly speak on behalf of the British Equestrian Federation, where we had to battle hard to make sure that that wasn't just put in one area of the strategy, but was put in the entirety of the strategy. Now, of course, in the wake of the ABC programme, the Queensland government has just had its report, and of course you're probably aware that in the UK there's now an independently chaired horse welfare board for British racing. That came out of a petition to the British Parliament and a debate in Parliament where there was increasing concern around whether British racing was in a position to regulate equine welfare. So across the world things are changing, and across the world the sport is reacting. But is it enough? So we just want to reflect now on what do we mean by good equine welfare. And from the start, if we look at the dictionary definition, it talks about the physical and mental well-being of our animals. And I think for too long, our interpretation of welfare has been too focused on the physical and not enough on the mental. But rather like the world is changing, our understanding of equine welfare is also changing through research, through appliance, through developments, and we therefore need to be open-minded to change the way we do things. As we so often say, just because we've done something, just because we've cared and managed our horses in a particular way for months, for years, for decades, doesn't necessarily make it right, and therefore we must be open-minded to changing the way we do things. If we just take a step back, you might well be familiar with the One Health concept. It's extremely relevant when we think about challenges like antimicrobial resistance, and it's where we talk about the health of our animals being very influenced and related to the health of people, being very influenced and related to the health of the environment. And the One Welfare concept very much reflects that. The fact that the welfare of our animals is interrelated to our own well-being, but also to the well-being and the biodiversity of our environment. So welfare is not something that you put in a box and look at in isolation. It's something that we need to be considering across the piece.